Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome Jorge Pinon. He is a senior research fellow at the Energy Institute here at the University of Texas at Austin. Jorge, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thank you, Robert. A pleasure to be with you today.
We're going to talk about Latin America and energy politics in the south of the U.S., but Jorge, if you don't mind, please introduce yourself. I didn't warn you, I'm ambushing you here, but all the guests on the podcast introduce themselves. So imagine you've arrived somewhere and you have maybe 45 seconds or a minute to introduce yourself. Please, go ahead.
I'm a Cuban American. I went to school at the University of Florida in Gainesville. I have a degree in economics and in Latin American studies. And right out of school, I went to work for Shell Oil. And that beginning took me through a 32-year career in the oil industry, worked for Shell, worked for Amoco in Latin America. I was in Mexico City for about 5 years. And then after the merger between Amoco and BP, I got transferred to Madrid, Spain, and worked for BP another 5 years or so. I've been basically on the downstream side of the business throughout Latin America for about 32 years. Retired from BP, and then did research work at the University of Miami and Florida International University before joining the University of Texas about 10 years ago. So today in academia, doing energy research in the region, but with a background in the business that gives me a different perspective than that from 100% academic.
Sure. And so when you say downstream, you're talking about refined products, gasoline, diesel fuel, propane, those kinds of things, and retail marketing of those things.
Right. And also work for the corporation quite a bit. So I'm familiar with the upstream and the petrochemical, but on the business units, I was always linked to a business unit with the oil business or the downstream. Yes.
Gotcha. So, well, look, I'm glad to have you on because I've done 130 some odd podcasts. I don't know, I've been ignoring Latin America, but the time to talk about it is now. Tell me what's going on in Cuba. We touched base a few weeks ago about because last month there was an explosion at the port at Matanzas in Cuba. And it looks like the situation in Cuba is very bad because of this explosion that destroyed the storage facilities for oil in Cuba. Bring us up to date, if you don't mind. What's happening in Cuba today? How bad are the electricity shortages and the overall situation in Cuba?
Well, the fire in Matanzas, which took out about 1 million barrels of storage in their main transshipment port, really was another, cherry on top of this pie that they've been having problems for a long, long time. As you know, today they depend on about 100% of the oil deficit from Venezuela. Of course, Venezuela is losing production. So they used to get about 100,000 barrels a day of oil from Venezuela. Now that's down to 50,000 barrels a day of oil. Their demand, by the way, is about 110,000 barrels a day. So still, they rely on about 50% of their oil demand from Venezuela. That's a major risk. They're putting all of their eggs in one basket, just like they did with the former Soviet Union.
They were getting sorry to interrupt, but they're getting very preferential pricing from Venezuela as well. No, because it's not just
more than preferential prices is zero cash flow. In other words, it's actually a barter deal for services.
Okay.
And they get oil in return. And those services are doctors, sport trainer, a bunch of people that they send over. So no, there is no cash flow impact on Cuba's economy for this 50,000 or 100,000 barrels of oil a day that they were getting from Venezuela. So it's a very sweet, very, very sweet deal from them. So that's their main risk, their dependency on Venezuela. What happens if there's a change in the Maduro government in Caracas? What is Cuba going to do?
Right.
But closer to home now today, yes, the loss of Matanzas brought about a major crisis that they were already having in their electric power sector.
Mm-hmm.
About half of their baseload electric generation is over 45 years old. These are old equipment that they put down from Russia and from Czechoslovakia. They lack capital maintenance. So they've been having power plants, basically baseload thermoelectric oil power plant trouble for the last 3 or 5 years. Now all of this is complicated because a lot of those power plants are going out of service. They need capital maintenance, and Cuba doesn't have the money, so they lose main storage facility. They're losing a lot of electricity from at least 50% of their power generation. And now they're bringing these floating power plants from Turkey to supply them with the power they needed. By the way, last night's peak hour deficit was 1,000 megawatts, which is
in
huge.
Cuba, right? And that's
Right.
roughly half of their load, something like that.
Yeah. So now they're having anywhere between 8 to 12 hours of blackouts, including Havana. In the 6 months ago, 12 months ago, they were trying to keep Havana steady because of the tourist trade.
Right.
But now even Havana is going into 8, 10 hour blackouts. So yes, the situation is critical and is certainly not getting any better, Robert.
Well, and to add to that, because as I've read about this, the key issue here for foreign trade is the dollars and other hard currency that's brought in by tourists. But you're not going to attract tourists if you don't have power at the hotel, right? So this problem feeds on itself. As the worse the electricity crisis gets, the less money there is to pay for oil or to pay for maintenance on the power plants. And so this problem seems like it gets worse the longer it goes on. Is that fair?
That is fair, and even their own, for example, they have a major strategy which they executed about 2 or 3 years ago. Very smart, we support it, which was biomass. Cuba is a big producer of sugarcane.
Yeah.
And just like Brazil, they started building these biomass generating facilities at some of their sugar mills. Well, guess what? This year, all of those facilities are shut down because there's no sugarcane. Cuba this year had their lowest sugarcane harvest since the republic was founded back in 1902. So all of this renewable plant that they had in place with biomass is now not giving fruit. Why? Because there's no sugarcane.
And why is that? And why such a bad harvest?
It's the economic model. There's no question, by the way. Let's talk about also the 800-pound gorilla that sometimes we try to avoid, which is the U.S. embargo. Yes, the U.S. embargo and other sanctions that the government of the U.S. has put against Cuba. Yes, that hurts and that pushes back the economy. But they have a lot of projects from Russia. They have a lot of projects from China that are not impacted by the embargo, and they're not materializing. It's just lack of management. It's a centralized economy, and that regrettably, whether with the embargo or without the embargo, Robert, it doesn't work. So yes, the problem with them, even renewable projects like biomass, which would be fantastic, is they're not working.
But they're not going to be able to fill that void, that 1,000 megawatts with biomass, are they? I mean, this biomass is going to be what, a few tens or maybe 100 or 200. I mean, this biomass is very limited in terms of its ability to scale, no?
Correct. And they're not even going to solve the problem with getting these power barges that they're bringing in from Turkey. I call this the Home Depot strategy. In other words, let's go to Home Depot and buy some small generators so they can keep us going. They need a total recapitalization of their electric power sector. We were very excited when Siemens, the German company, and Total were talking to the Cubans about building a combined cycle LNG plant in Matanzas, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And that did not go forward because the Cuban people cannot afford the electricity at the price that Total and Siemens needed to charge in order to build a 600 megawatt combined cycle LNG plant.
Right.
So even that project now is dead.
And
So
the
even
price
though
of LNG in the international market has been soaring, right? Where
and
it's
also has been going up.
It's
correct.
what it's
But
30 or $40 into the Asian market now, right? I haven't checked it today, but the JKM marker is something on that order. No, something like I didn't, like I said, I haven't checked it, but it's a very expensive way to produce power.
Correct. And remember that 80% of Cuba's current electricity generation is generated by oil.
Right.
Half of that Cuban crude oil, which is very heavy, is about a 10 API, about 5% sulfur, which is really awful on those thermoelectric power plants. So even the oil that they burn today, about 80% of their thermoelectric production is oil-based, is with high sulfur fuel oil. So we were really excited when we saw Siemens and Total talking to the Cubans about natural gas, again, still a fossil fuel, but
Right.
certainly much cleaner than the oil that they're burning. And also, it diversifies their energy sources. So they're instead of oil from Venezuela, now at least you have LNG, which is more of a global-wide commodity.
Right. Well, let's talk. You mentioned domestic production. Talk about QPET. Are they? I saw them. I have a QPET hat that I got at a conference some time ago. I think it was the World Petroleum Congress several years ago. Are they able to increase their petroleum production? I mean, I know it's been an objective of the Cuban government for a long time, particularly offshore. Have they made any headway in that regard?
No, in the 2012 campaign, there were 4 offshore deep water prospects by companies like Repsol, Statoil, Petronas from Malaysia, ONGC from India, and other companies. And those 4 wells that were drilled offshore proved to be non-commercial. So there is no activity whatsoever going offshore. Cuba's current production is mature. It's been around for about 40 years. It's basically shallow fields right offshore that are drilled horizontally from shore. And that production is dropping. Canada's Sherritt, which, as you know, is in the nickel business, but they're also in the oil business, was their partner for a number of years. And they're really the ones that helped QPET bring or monetize that shallow water production. They're going now the oil business. They're still in the nickel business, but Sherritt is no longer in the oil business. But no, QPET's or Cuba's oil production is limited. Again, like 40,000 barrels a day of heavy oil from shallow fields. And we don't envision anything further here in the next few years.
And because it's heavy, it's going to be heavy and high sulfur. It's going to be hard on the power plants, right? Because it's going to require more maintenance on the boilers. The rest of this, if you're running that grade of crude, and it's also going to be more highly polluting, just in terms of particulate and so on, for the people who live near the plants. No.
Correct, but that's the only option that they have. If there was no U.S. embargo, of course, they could bring it down to our former refinery at Amoco at Texas City, which loves that kind of heavy crude. I mean, Amoco at Texas City used to run crude from Guatemala. Guatemala crude is probably one of the worst crudes around. So again, even the Cuban refineries that you have today, which are the old Texaco refinery in Santiago and the old Exxon refinery in Havana, those are basically topping plants with very little, if any, conversion capacity. So the only option that they have for the heavy Cuban crude oil is really to burn it as fuel in their electric power plants because they can't refine it and they can't export it.
So explain what you mean by a topping refinery, please.
A topping refinery is a refinery that just have a distillation unit and has your basic cuts of light ends, naphtha, and then a lot of fuel oil on the bottom. They might have a vacuum tower to produce some middle distillates, but no hydrocracker, no reformer, no conversion capacity, or for that matter, hydrotreating capacity that can take the sulfur out of the diesel, for example.
I see.
So no, Cuba's refineries are very elementary, with, again, no conversion capacity, able to extract high-value light products or hydrotreating facilities to take the sulfur out of, for example, out of diesel and produce low sulfur diesel.
Sure. So let's talk about the power ships. I'm passingly familiar in my latest book and also in our documentary, the documentary I made with my colleague Tyson Culver, Juice. We went to Beirut and we saw the power ships that are run by the Turks. Car Power Ship is the name of the company. but it's Lebanon and Cuba that they're what I see these power ships that where they are deployed, they're generally deployed to, and I'm going to say the failed states, right? That Lebanon's a failed state. They don't have enough capital, enough civil society. I'll use that as to be able to build their own power plants. So they're leasing these power plants from the Turks. But can Cuba even do this? I mean, do they even have the capital to get the Turks to lease them a power plant? And if they do, where they're going to have to pay in dollars, right? I mean, they're going to need hard currency to pay for the lease and for the fuel oil. So is this even a viable option? And you're quoted in an article that was published today, September 1st in Reuters on this very issue. How do you see it?
Well, that's the whole problem. They currently have 4 power barges. They have 3 in Mariel and 1 in Havana for a total of about 300 megawatts. The President Diaz-Canel was on TV about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and he was talking about an additional 500 megawatts of new financiable projects that he was bringing on by the end of the year. What that Reuters article say that those 500 megawatts was basically additional floating power stations that they were discussing with the Turks. But their problem was just exactly what you just said. The Turks says, wait a minute, we're putting a lot of eggs in your basket. We want some sort of guarantee that you're going to be able to pay us.
Right.
Now, the fuel is provided by the Cubans, so that's not a problem. But as far as the lease agreements, I think what the Turks now want is some sort of guarantee, because this could be as high as 800 megawatts of floating capacity.
Right.
That somehow, as you said, the Cubans are going to have to pay for it. So the Turks right now, I understand, like the Reuters article say, they're in conversations, and all that the Turks want is, hey, give me some sort of guarantee that you're going to pay my bill.
Sure. And so those, you said there are 4 power barges at 300 megawatts. Is that all car power ship?
Yes,
all those are okay. So I didn't realize the Cubans already had 4 power ships that are already offshore. There are 3 at Mariel and 1 Havana, you said.
That is correct.
So they're going to need hard currency to get more capacity. But as I see it, and it's something we talked about in the film in Lebanon, where if and it happened, the Lebanese couldn't pay their bills, so the Turks took the power ships and went back to Turkey. So this is the other option, that if they may not be able to afford any more capacity. And that's how I read what you told Reuters, was that where are the Cubans going to get the money?
Well, I got in trouble with an interview that I had at the Wall Street Journal, and they quoted me using the word that, to me, the imminent collapse of Cuba's electric power system was facing us. Someone in Havana got a little bit upset at that. But if you look at it, what the problem is that as some of these units come down, that puts more pressure on the ones that are already working without the necessary maintenance or capital maintenance that they require.
Right.
So it's a domino effect. When one of them goes down, the other ones are put on more pressure because they have to pick up that deficit.
Right.
And they're all in the same boat. I mean, right now, as of this morning, of the 20 units in the 8 thermoelectric power plants, only 12 were working. Only 12 were working, and those are working at less than 75% of rated capacity. So the more pressure you put on those units, the worse it's going to get. I just don't see short term, without these power barges, a solution to the problem. And then they don't have money to do what they need to do, which is to recapitalize the whole system.
Right. Well, I'll ask this question because it's one that I mentioned this. Is Cuba a failed state?
Sir, they're close to it. The problem with Cuba, I try to put us, by the way, I haven't gone to Cuba in 2 or 3 years, but I used to go every other year. They let me in. I still have my Cuban passport. So I'm not being political here, but.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, but you have an American passport and a Cuban passport.
The Cuban Constitution says that when you're born in Cuba, it doesn't matter where you live, it doesn't matter what other citizenship you have, you're always a Cuban. And if you ever want to come back to Cuba, you need to do it with a Cuban passport. So yes, I have a Cuban passport, which is valid. Of course, I also have my U.S. passport. The Cuban passport, I only use it to go in and out of Havana. But again, the problem here is that if they want a socialist state with socialist medicine and socialist education, that's fine. But open up the economy, decentralize the economic system, and let PPP projects, that's a public-private partnership projects, come in. As long as the state is a regulator, I don't have any problem. But no, they're still back in the old Stalin or Stalinist model of this is a central economy. Robert, last year the tomato harvest failed. You know why? Because when the tomatoes were ready to be picked up from the agricultural cooperatives, there were no trucks, because the trucks belonged to another ministry and they were doing something else. And the tomatoes, half of the tomato harvest last year, rot in the fields.
Ah, man, that's
That's
hard.
not embargo. That wasn't the embargo. That was that the trucks belonged to another ministry, and
Right.
they had not to talk to the agricultural ministry, and the trucks never showed up.
Man, that's just hard to hear. I mean, it's just hard to hear the amount of labor that went into producing all that produce, and yet it rots in the field because of just this lack of coordination. I mean, how does that feel? I have to ask you the personal question, because you're a Cubano by heritage. I mean, how do you feel about, I've not been to Cuba, but the culture is amazing. Their ballet, their baseball, they have these amazing cultural things, and yet the economy and the way it's running just seems like it's
what that shows me? That shows me the future that the country has.
How do you mean?
That's why I'm here today, and that's why we all get excited, and that's why we don't want to get into the politics. If the Cuban people at the end of the day want a socialist government, as far as education and Medicare and all of that, that's fine. But open up the economy. So Cubans today, they can open a restaurant. You know that a paladar, Cuban can open a paladar today. But they can only open a paladar that has no more than 10 tables, and they cannot open more than one paladar. So they tell you, open your little restaurant in Havana, and they're making money. But by the way, you can only have a maximum seating of 10 tables, because then what happens is you become a capitalist, and that goes against our,
So why 10? I mean, just as you say that, Jorge, I'm just thinking, well, why 10? Why not 11? And then do they count the chairs? Can the chairs be comfortable?
Oh, the inspectors. Oh, no. The inspectors come, and I have seen paladares being shut down because they were serving more people than the government allowed them to serve.
It's truly, it's just hard to, having not seen that kind of system, it's hard to get my mind around it, right? But, well, then, so I don't want to, you said you want to stay away from politics, but I mean, is this regime going to last? I mean, is this just being undermined by all of these effects that are, I want to talk about migration in a minute, but I mean, is this Fidel held on for longer than anyone ever expected? Is this regime going to hold on too?
Raul is already in his late 80s. By the way, he came out, I don't know if you saw him or not, but he came out last week and visited one of the power plants, urging the workers to fix it, as quick as they could. So he's not in, but he's still around.
Right.
I think when he passes away, and 2 or 3 others that are in their 80s from the old guard, I don't know. It's going to be difficult. There was also an article recently that so far this year, 177,000 Cubans have crossed the border through Mexico. Cuban immigration this year is the largest immigration that there has been since the 60s. But that, by the way, helps the Cuban because it avoids a lot of street and social unrest. So the Cubans are certainly, in a way, promoting for people to get out through Nicaragua, by the way, because that's the escape valve. That's a valve that, in a way, helps the government keep control of what's going on. I don't know, Robert.
But let me interrupt there because it seems like that's the way the government keeps control. But who are going to be the people that are leaving? It would be the ones that maybe have skills, or the ones who are ambitious, and who's going to be left behind? It's going to be. I'm just musing here. I don't know this for a fact, but it would be the old, the young, the people that aren't going to be productive. I mean, is that how you see it?
And guess what? Because the Wall Street Journal also addresses the issue that the ones that are staying behind, the ones that are not leaving, are the Afro-Cubans, because most of the Cubans in the U.S. are white, and they're not sending remittances to their families. So the ones that are leaving now are people that have families in the U.S. and send them money for them to get out, and those happen to be white Cubans. Afro-Cubans are very, very few in the U.S., very, very few. So now, in fact, the article says that Cuba is getting darker and darker because, again, of the Afro-Cubans that are staying behind, because they don't have money to get out, and they don't have money that is being sent from their relatives outside of Cuba. So if there is a revolution in Cuba or another revolution in Cuba, let me tell you what the article and other I'm not a social scientist, but are predicting that it's going to be the Afro-Cubans, the ones that are really going to rebel against this government.
Let me follow up because there's a piece in Fortune. I just want to follow up on what you just said because the numbers are about the same, but it says border officials have encountered nearly 178,000. You said 177,000 people fleeing the communist-run Caribbean nation of 11 million so far this fiscal year. Most are coming by land after leaving the island for other Latin American nations that don't require visas. The current wave, this is a quote from a newsletter from the Center for Democracy in the Americas. The current wave of Cuban migrants has officially surpassed the previous two largest waves of Cuban migration to the U.S., the Mariel boat lift in 1980 and the Balsero crisis of 1994 combined. So the Cuban out migration is adding to the immigration pressure at the southern U.S. border. Because of like other countries in Latin America, they're trying to find a better place. And I wasn't aware of the dimensions or the numbers on Cuba. But could those numbers go up even from here if these electricity prices and shortages continue?
Oh yes, no question about it. By the way, one of the major problems that the State Department or issues that the State Department has always faced is what happens when there is a total social collapse in Cuba, either because Venezuela is no longer there to supply the 50,000 barrels a day. When there is really a crisis in Cuba, how are we, the U.S., going to handle it? Because then you're going to have a bunch of balseros coming to the U.S., people across the border through Mexico. I mean, that could very well be a political problem even here in the U.S. So there are folks that saying, hey, we need to help Cuba in order to avoid this crisis that could be a crisis for us domestically here in the U.S.
Because the social systems would be overwhelmed by all the migrants, which was what happened initially from Mariel, right? And back in
Right. The difference is, and there's a family nearby here, that most of these Cubans that are coming, by the way, do have relatives back in the U.S. And there's already a support infrastructure by friends and relatives. But still, yes, it's going to be impact in the U.S., particularly in South Florida, and we'll see what happens.
Right. So we've talked about Venezuela. So I wrote about Hugo Chavez many years ago, and Chavez initially, when he came into office, appeared to be an ally of the U.S. and then wasn't, and now he's dead, succeeded by Nicolas Maduro, who's now famously been, I don't know if he's been indicted or it's clearly he's a narco. It's from everything that I've read. Venezuela was one of the jewels of Latin America, and PDVSA was one of the successful national oil companies in the world. Is PDVSA ruined, and can it recover?
You know, PDVSA, when I came into this business, PDVSA was the top NOC. It was a national oil company. It was well run. But remember that it's the former Lagoven and Corpoven and Maraven, which are the former Shell, Texaco, and Chevron entities that got nationalized, and then they became PDVSA. So the key with PDVSA was that it was run like an oil company. It wasn't run like a national oil company. And the governments, until Chavez came to power, stay away from it. They recognize the value of PDVSA, and they say, listen, I don't care who's running it. I just want to monetize PDVSA so I can have then my social strategy, whatever my political strategy is. And what happened in 2003.
And so I'm sorry to interrupt, but so PDVSA became the economic engine that allowed for Maduro and the to fund social programs. So the government took a light hand and they let the technocrats run the business, is everything that I've read. And I think I'm just repeating what you said, but I want to drive that point home because it was Venezuela has enormous oil reserves and they've been successful in developing, but it's heavy oil and it requires a lot of refining and technology to get it out of the ground and into the marketplace. But anyway, I interrupted. Please go ahead.
No. Venezuela had those two key factors. Number one, they had the reserves. We knew where PDVSA's oil was. It was on the Orinoco. We knew that it was heavy. We were developing the technology. We had the technology. And then we had the management. Yeah. At the end of the day, you can have all the oil you want. You can have all the technology that you want, but you cannot apply that technology effectively to monetize your resource. Is worthless. Right. Look at Venezuela today, the largest holder of oil reserves in the world, and is producing less than 700,000 barrels a day.
Is that the latest number? I hadn't checked the numbers.
Yes, the OPEC, the last number that I saw from OPEC was about 700,000 barrels a day. And Robert, what's interesting about this that I would have never thought, who's the largest producer of oil today in Latin America? At 3 million barrels a day is Brazil. So here you have PDVSA was at 3 million barrels a day when Chavez took over. Now it's at 700. Mexico was also about in 2004. Mexico was about 3 million barrels a day. And here they are at less than 2,000 barrels a day. And Brazil, of all places, is at 3 million barrels a day. Even with Lula as president, who was a socialist president. But Lula was smart. Lula said, you know what? I'm a socialist. I'm going to have my social policies. But I recognize that Petrobras is my golden goose egg or whatever you call it. I'm going to leave it alone. And he left it alone. And that's why.
But let me go. But so I just want to go back to Pemex. So you said in the early 2000s, Mexico was producing about 3 million. You said 2,000, but it's 3 million to 2 million today. I don't know the numbers. What's Mexico's production
today is producing less than 2 million barrels a day.
Okay.
I forgot. But back in 2004, they were producing 3 million barrels a day, which is the same figure more or less that Venezuela had.
Right.
Those two countries have dropped. Again, because of management, not necessarily because of oil reserves, because of management, not necessarily because of technology, but because of management. And then you have Brazil, who had the offshore reserves, but they knew how to manage the development of those resources. And here they are today at 3 million barrels a day, the largest producer in the region.
And arguably, Petrobras is among the most sophisticated offshore companies in the world. I mean, bar none, right? I mean, their ability to develop a very deep offshore resources. Well, I mean, I know there are other companies that are doing it, but Petrobras has been one of the pioneers, haven't they?
Petrobras and Shell, both Shell and Petrobras, as far as I'm concerned, they're the top deep water operators in the world. No question about it.
And what depths are they operating? I don't know those numbers. I know I've seen them before, but about what are the depths on some of these
I forgot.
frontier?
The challenge with Brazil, of course, is that there is subsalt.
Right.
So in other words, their field have to face the subsalt layer to go through. But it's deep. It's very, very deep.
Yeah, both deep water and deep under the surface of under the ocean floor as well, right? So high temperature, high pressure. Those are all part of the things that they have to overcome. Let me talk a little bit more about Mexico because there's a new book out by an American guy named Peter Zion, who's a geopolitical strategist. His new book is called "The End of the World Is Just the Beginning," and I've heard him on several podcasts talk about Mexico. He says Mexico now, given what's happening in the world with kind of what he's calling is the decline of what had been the existing world order since World War II, that for the U.S., Mexico is our most important foreign country, that relationship with Mexico now has become much more important and that will be more important in the years ahead. How do you see it? Because Mexico, I mean, the country seems to be making progress. The maquilas are very productive. We have close trade ties, long border here in Mexico in Texas with Mexico. Is Zion right that this Mexico relationship is the key one for the U.S. in the years to come?
It is, but our challenge is that today with Andrés Manuel López Obrador, you have a president in Mexico that wants to return, certainly in the energy field, back to 1933, which is when Pemex was it. Pemex was the only refiner. Pemex had 100% of the production. Even CFE, which is the electric power company, is now going back to a monopolistic type of model. So you have a president who is extremely nationalistic, who is pushing back all of the reforms brought in by Enrique Peña Nieto during his 2013-2014, when he put forward the energy reform, allowing international companies to come and drill, and for international oil companies to come and open service stations. I don't know when is the last time that you were in Mexico City, but you drive Mexico City and you see Shell and Mobil and Chevron. You see all of those brands all over the place. López Obrador is even now going after the retail gasoline facilities. So the answer to your question is yes, I agree. Mexico is an important partner of the U.S. Remember, we are their largest supplier of natural gas. They are our largest customer as far as natural gas imports or exports are concerned. So in energy and in business, they're important to Texas, by the way, not only to the whole U.S., but our challenge is the current administration in Mexico City, which still has another 2 years to go. Remember, in Mexico, the presidential term is 6 years.
Right.
So where is López Obrador going to end with his nationalistic policy in the next 2 years? And then what's going to come after him?
Right.
Is his party, Morena, going to be able to still keep control of Congress and most of the state legislatures, which, by the way, is what's required to make constitutional changes in Mexico? So yes, it's important, but we have a challenge of where the next 2-4 years are going to go.
So it's a political risk issue, right? That you have the one with this changeover every 6 years, that there's no consistency in terms of longer term policy. And particularly if you're drilling for oil and gas, you need the rule of law, and you need a clear governmental, I'm not going to say mandate, but a clear government policy that you can count on for not 5 or 6 years, but for 20 or 10 or 20 years, right? I mean, this is one of the key problems in that kind of big foreign investment that the energy companies need, that foreign energy companies need to move into Mexico. Is that fair?
That was the question when I was at Amoco. Those are the questions that we had for Argentina. That was the question that we had in Bolivia. That was the question that we had in Egypt. The agreements in place to monetize those resources were acceptable rate of return and so on. But the question is, like you said, political continuity. When
Right.
you need 20-25 years in order to monetize all of that investment. Remember, our industry is an upfront industry. You come in, you invest hundreds, if not billions of dollars, and then you need 20-25 years to recover that. So what guarantee do we have? The question at the board and the executive committee was always, what guarantee do we have that this government or future governments are going to continue to play by the same rules?
Right.
And nobody was able ever to give them an answer. But if the risk was good enough, i.e. Argentina, Bolivia, Egypt, we decided to move forward. But yeah, that is the risk. Continuity of the rules of the game, are there so we can, again, monetize those reserves and monetize that investment.
So what about Argentina now? Another country that has had political upheaval, continues to have some, but seems somewhat more stable. The Peronistas seem to be on the decline a little bit, but you also have the return of a more socialist presence or president rather in Chile. What about Argentina? There was a lot of talk about Vaca Muerta and potential for shale in Argentina. Where is that these days?
For the last 10, 15 years, in fact, I'll even go back to when I was in school. Argentina was one of those countries that when you look at all the check marks of what would make Argentina a great country, they had it. Land, agricultural, energy. I mean, they were
educated public.
educated. I mean, they tick every single box, but they never grew up. The problem with Argentina is they never grew up. And again, there was no continuity. Every 4 or 5 years, they changed, whether it was exchange rates, which was a monetary policy, taxes, you name it. I mean, there has not been continuity in Argentina for the last 50 years. And they've been able to survive. So again, right now, for example, with Vaca Muerta, the biggest potential in Argentina is not oil. The biggest potential in Argentina is natural gas out of their shale formations. But in order to do that, they need to export the gas not only for domestic consumption, but they need to be able to export that as LNG. Well, that's where they're tied up right now. But the government needs to support the ability for producers in Argentina to export natural gas by facilitating the liquefaction facilities. But again, they're tied up. Remember that in Latin America, 90% of the oil companies and the oil in Latin America belongs to the state. Refining capacity, 90% of refining capacity in Latin America belongs to the state. E&P, development of those resources, they belong to the state. Argentina is the only one that has more of an international, at least in refining, role by international companies. But when you have the state as the owner of the resource, and they have the pressure, social pressure, they're a socialist country that are populist, and they promise their people everything. They don't have the money to spend in monetizing and developing their energy sectors. How many countries in Latin America have changed government just because of an increase in electricity prices, or much less the increase in bus fares? Right. I have seen governments in Latin America, in Peru, in Ecuador, in Bolivia, in the Andean region, that have been overthrown because they increased bus fares. And people were not in the street, and that's it. So that's the other challenge with the region. Today, I don't know if you're aware, but today, 55% of Latin America's refined product imports come from the U.S., come from Gulf Coast PADD 3. The U.S. today has become the de facto refinery for Latin America. One of the reasons that we in PADD 3 are running our refineries at 91% of capacity is because we export a lot of that fuel to Latin America.
I didn't realize it was that. I didn't realize it was that high. 55% of the diesel and the gasoline and fuel oil in Latin America.
Diesel and LPG. The problem with Latin America is their refinery capacity is only operating at 53%. Again, because of maintenance, and the government is not spending money. The other one is conversion. Oil in Latin America is getting heavier. So the heavier the oil, you need more conversion capacity at the refinery in order to get more light products. Sulfur, you need heavy diesel hydrocracking or hydrotreating facility in order to produce clean diesel. So what they're doing is they're exporting their oil. They export their oil. Colombia, Argentina, Ecuador export their oil to the U.S., and we export clean products, mainly diesel, to those countries.
More than you said diesel now a couple of times, more than gasoline. They don't gasoline.
Yeah, very little gasoline. They usually can take care of gasoline themselves.
I see.
In the case of Brazil, of course, as you know, we export diesel to Brazil, but the advantage that Brazil has is that they produce quite a bit ethanol, which goes into their gasoline pool. But in countries like Ecuador, Argentina, Colombia, and Brazil, we mostly export diesel, again, low sulfur diesel,
right,
to those countries.
And that's because the U.S. refiners on the Gulf Coast, it's the Nelson Complexity Index, right? That we have these refineries that are able to produce the hydrogen, to do the hydrotreating to pull out the sulfur, but also the catalytic conversion to be able to convert more of the barrel into the products you want, right?
And Robert, we love heavy oil. In fact, that's why the oil that we are exporting today out of the Permian is light oil. Right. We like heavy oil. And that's what Latin America is producing. We don't like light sweet. We used to import a lot of light sweet oil from West Africa. no longer. The Canadian crude that's coming down the Keystone, all of that is heavy oil. We like heavy oil. Why? Because we have the conversion capacity in the Gulf Coast to process it and to squeeze every single gallon out of high value product out of that oil, which is, of course, cheaper than light oil produced in Nigeria or Angola or Algeria for that matter.
Right. Yeah, that was one of the key points I was going to add, that ability to crack that heavy crude, the refiners can buy it at a lower price relative to the posted price, right? They sell it, they buy that at a discount to West Texas Intermediate or Brent
Right.
or the posted prices, and then they make their profit in that crack spread, right? The conversion of the crude into the refined products. So handicapped in Latin America, Jorge, you've been, and by the way, my guest is Jorge Pinon. He is a senior research fellow at the University of Texas at the Energy Institute there. You can find more about him and the Energy Institute at energy.utexas.edu. So handicapped Latin America, you've talked about Brazil, we've talked about several other countries. Which country, and I know Panama has had some serious problems recently as well in terms of electricity production. Which countries in Latin America are doing the best and which are doing the worst? We've talked about Cuba already, but handicap it for me.
We haven't talked about the new poster child in the region, which is Guyana. Guyana, as you know, Exxon made major discoveries of as much as 10 billion barrels of offshore oil. And Guyana today is already at almost 200,000 barrels a day. Guyana is the country to watch because it's only 700,000 people. So one of the questions that we have is what's going to happen in Guyana with this monumental gain that the country is now facing of all of these revenues that are going to come in. Is this really going to help the people of Guyana? But Guyana today is becoming, for Exxon and Hess, which, by the way, are the partners in most of this production, the discovery is huge. It's one of the largest frontier discoveries that we have had, certainly in the region, for the last 15, 20 years. So to me, the country to follow today is Guyana, not only because of its production, but because of the impact that it could have in the political and social stability of that small country. Next one to watch, of course, is Brazil. I think Brazil is still the engine in the region. By the way, one of the major problems, and we haven't talked, Robert, is that about 65% of the electricity in Latin America is hydro.
Okay.
That is a huge risk, especially because of climate change and of drought. Both Brazil and Venezuela has been in tough situations because of their hydro production has gone down quite a bit, again, because of drought. Guess what's their fuel in order to cover that deficit is natural gas. Where's the natural gas coming? Is LNG from the U.S.
Right.
But no longer today, because our gas today, our LNG, is going to Europe.
Or to Asia, right? So Latin America is being priced out of the market by wealthier customers from somewhere else. Then is that fair?
You got it. So the next thing that we're keeping an eye on at the Institute is what's going to happen with hydro production of electricity in the region, i.e., as a result of climate change, and where is that gap, or how is that deficit in electricity going to be covered, which it should be with combined cycle natural gas plants. And the only way they're going to fuel, because remember, very little Latin American countries have natural gas or large production of natural gas. That's going to be LNG that at least 2019 and 2020 and 2021 came from the U.S. That's no longer the case. Our LNG is going to Europe.
So will they be burning more? Because this is what we're already seeing in Europe and other places around the world, that oil on a per million BTU basis is actually undercutting the price in some places of natural gas and even coal. So will we see then more countries in Latin America burning oil for power gen?
Oil and also coal in the case of Chile. Chile was one of the few countries in the region that had a number of coal plants. And I think they already shut down, or the previous government had shut down 2 or 3 of those plants. Now there's discussion of whether they will have to bring back those 2 or 3 coal plants. The small Dominican Republic had a small coal plant. They had to bring it back on stream again because of the lack of LNG and natural gas. So yes, oil and natural gas are going to be the options again to cover the deficit in hydro if we have such a situation of drought. Central America, you're talking about Panama, is geothermal. The future of Central America should be geothermal. They have the potential. And we at the Energy Institute and at UT, we have a couple of projects as far as geothermal technology. And we think that's the future of Central America, by the way, geothermal electric power generation.
And not wind and solar?
Well, again, listen, every matrix, you have to spread all of your eggs in one basket. For example, Chile, talk about solar and Chile as far as their production of green hydrogen. So, yes, solar and wind are certainly key components of every country's matrix. All that I'm saying is that in Latin America, in Central America, geothermal does play a very important role along with, yes, wind and solar.
Well, so let's talk about that because that's something I'm not very familiar with, the geothermal in Central America. I've seen it myself been in plants in Iceland, and I know in Africa and Djibouti they have quite significant, in Kenya, some other places they have significant geothermal potential. But isn't one of the handicaps or one of the points about geothermals is they're very large upfront capital risk, right? That you have to drill it, you have to prove it, and then after that the costs are relatively low because your fuel costs are zero. But still, it requires a lot of sophistication and a ton of capital up front. Is that going to be available? And what companies are going to be the ones that will pioneer that in Latin America or in Central America rather?
That is not the current obstacle. The current obstacle is that you have 6 countries in Latin America, and you have a lack of interconnectivity. So
in Central America, so Costa Rica, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Panama,
Honduras, Costa Rica, Panama, all of them, Belize. So in order to really monetize the geothermal production of the whole region, not just one country, because they do face the challenge that you just mentioned, but if you put the whole region together and you interconnect the whole region and you act as one unit, then the return is there. So one of the challenges, so there's the potential. So geothermal has the potential. The problem is that you have 6 little countries among themselves who are not together in what the strategy ought to be and what the model ought to be, and interconnectivity, so you can count in the whole region as your customer, and that then allows you to monetize the potential of geothermal.
So you need high voltage transmission.
All of that, but again, you need political interconnectivity. You have to be sure that El Salvador and Honduras don't go back to a soccer war that they had back in, I forgot when it was, that the 2 countries went to war because of a soccer match. So
when was this? No, I'm not familiar with. How long ago was this?
No, go back, and that's another story. But
go back. Honduras and El Salvador.
Honduras and El Salvador went to war. I forgot when it was because of a soccer match. So that's the instability of these countries. Regrettably, when the Spaniards left, everybody divvied up, and Central America today as a region, if they can get their act together as far as interconnectivity and rules and tariffs and things that are equal across the board, then we can certainly monetize a lot of the geothermal potential that the region has.
So, Jorge, as you're saying that, what I'm hearing is that the political stability, the political viability has to precede any of the energy viability and stability.
Everything in my business goes to stewardship. Everything in my business goes to management. It's not an issue of resource, it's how you manage that resource. But regrettably, and again, Robert, I learned that because I happened to work for 3 major oil companies in which you had project management, you had rules, you had things to follow, you had a strategy, you had a business plan. These countries don't have any of that. That is the problem. The problem is not the resource of the country. These countries have resources. The problem is, how do you manage those resources so they can, produce good for the social life and economic value of the country. We have never learned that. We haven't learned that in the last 100 years. And I don't know if we're going to learn it tomorrow.
But we can hope.
We can hope.
Well, just the last couple of questions. Then since we've covered a lot of countries in a short time, and I like to keep the podcast at an hour or less. So Jorge, what are you reading? I always ask my guests what books are on the top of their lists or at the top of their table nightstand. What are you reading these days?
I'm reading two books on Cuba's sugar industry. I'm sorry. I still believe that what's going to get Cuba out of trouble is going to be the recapitalization of the sugar industry. Because I look at it, sugar cane is no longer sugar. Sugar cane is fuel, ethanol. Sugar cane is power, biomass. And yes, sugar cane is sugar when it's at, like today, I think it's 20 cents a pound. But when you have a system like Brazil, that the sugar industry can switch from ethanol to sugar production, depending on where is the best netback. And when they constantly are burning bagasse in their power plants, that is the most efficient. By the way, it's 10 times more efficient than corn as far as the production of ethanol.
Right.
So I'm reading a couple of books.
And what's the title? What's the title of the sugar book on Cuba? Or is it?
I'll have to get him.
Is it in English or in
Espanol? One of them is from Pepe Alvarez, who is a professor at the University of Florida. In fact, what I'll do, I'll send you the link to those 2 or 3 books that I'm reading. Okay. The other thing is, of course, that the top university, along with LSU, as far as agricultural sugar, is Florida. So we do have a lot of friends over there. And what we're trying to do is put together a roadmap for Cuba of how to follow and how to grow the sugar industry in the future.
To follow the path that was really pioneered by the Brazilians. Then is that
correct?
Yeah. So what gives you hope then, Jorge? You've you're a Cubano, you're an American. You've had a lot of experience, and we've talked about some things that, frankly, are a little exasperating. I won't say desperate, I won't say depressing, but that we have to hope for better government and better management. After all your experience in Latin America and looking at the energy world, what gives you hope?
In Latin America, my hope is limited to the governments that our people elect in the next 5 or 10 years. Regrettably, they are the Correas, they are the Lulas, they are people that are populist, that promise the world to their people, which is not achievable. And regrettably, our countries lack the maturity and the education and the experience that those governments and those folks are never going to be able to deliver. But as long as the governments in Latin America continue to elect populist leaders like Andrés Manuel López Obrador, I think our future is very dim. And that's the same for Cuba, by the way. So I'm sorry, I'm not high in Latin America.
That's fine. Well, so then more broadly then, well, tell me what gives you hope. I mean, let's set with our focus of the moment more broadly, if you don't mind, Jorge. Tell me what makes you hope.
I tell you what gives me hope is us, the U.S. Even with all the political problems that we're facing in the energy front, renewables are moving forward. Conventional or fossil fuels are still around. I think that a lot of people thought that oil was going to be dead. It isn't. Like Mark Twain said, reports of my death are a bit exaggerated. I think oil is going to be around. People in the U.S. fail to realize that about 22% of oil goes into the petrochemical industry. It's not only transportation. Mm-hmm. They fail to realize that in the U.S., less than 2% of oil fuels our electric power system. But I still think that the U.S. is moving forward. We are the top technological country in the world. Technology is moving forward in solar, utility scale solar batteries, which are really the next step that we have to take a look at. Hydrogen, the work that we're doing in hydrogen in this country and in some countries in Latin America. So I have a lot of hope in the technology and the know-how that the U.S. has in the energy sector. Maybe because I worked at the University of Texas, which is the #1 university as far as energy is concerned in the world, and I see what's going on, and I see what's moving forward, and that I'm very hopeful about all of that. So I'm hopefully and positive and optimistic as far as where this country is going, certainly on the technological side of energy development.
Well, that's a good place to stop. So that's where we'll stop then. Jorge, my guest has been Jorge Pinon. He's a senior research fellow at the Energy Institute at the University of Texas at Austin. You can find more about him and his colleagues at energy.utexas.edu. Jorge, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. We haven't been acquainted until now, and it was a great conversation. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks for having me.
And all of you in podcast land, thanks for tuning into this episode of the Power Hungry Podcast. Tune in for the next one. See ya.